My name is Mark Borsuk. I'm the James L. and Elizabeth M. Vincent Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Duke. I'm also the Director of Duke RESILE. This is a new university-wide climate research initiative that's based in the Pratt School of Engineering. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Risk Science for Climate Resilience, the first in what will be a series of the Duke Climate Collaboration Symposia. The series is funded by a gift from the Duke Endowment in support of the Duke Climate Commitment, and it's intended to foster new interdisciplinary collaborations among Duke University scholars and external partners with the ultimate goal of accelerating climate solutions. The first symposium has been organized by Duke RESILE and by the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. As I'm sure you're all well aware, climate change poses multiple interacting risks to humans and the environment that are only expected to intensify with additional warming. Reduction of CO2 needs to remain the focus, as that's the only way to get at the root source of climate change. Yet it's becoming increasingly apparent that we're on a global warming trajectory that will put us above the 2-degree temperature limit specified in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Further, as CO2 has a long lifetime in the atmosphere, warming can be expected to continue for centuries in the absence of net negative carbon emissions. So it's therefore urgent that we develop approaches for managing the risks of climate change that can no longer be addressed through emissions reductions alone. The insurance and finance sectors are, of course, well positioned to play a central role in managing climate risk. These industries are unique in their ability to assess and price risk, allocate capital, offer financial protection, and influence risk-related behavior. Yet climate risk poses some fundamental challenges to conventional insurance and finance operations. These include a lack of historical data on climate damages, irresolvable uncertainty on future climate scenarios, and challenges in modeling climate risks at the scale of individual insurance policies or investment decisions. Not to mention the complex and dynamic business environment that includes continued development in high-risk locations, rising climate-related losses, and simultaneous regulatory pressure to maintain rates. The consequences of these business challenges are already evidenced by recent decisions of some insurance companies to pull out of high-risk areas like California, Florida, Louisiana. This creates economy-wide repercussions by transmitting some of the climate risk to banks, bondholders, investors, and the government in the form of stranded assets, loan defaults, and subsidized insurance programs. And of course, all of this eventually falls on families and communities, especially those who are already overburdened and under-resourced. So it's clear that a science-based, university-led effort is needed to clear a pathway through this thorny landscape. Although through rigorous inquiry, empirical analysis, and interdisciplinary collaboration, academic research has the capacity to generate objective, actionable strategies that can inform policy, shapes practice, and drive transformative change in our ability to manage climate risk and to build community resilience. This two-day symposium is the first step in a concerted effort for Duke University to become a leader in this critical endeavor. Gathering this week, we're fortunate that the ideas, the plans, and the partnerships that we produce over the next couple of days won't be without a specific avenue to further progress. Last month, a group of faculty were awarded a grant from NSF and from NOAA to support the process of planning an Industry University Collaborative Research Center, or IUCRC, that can harness the research, reporting, and convening power of a university-industry partnership to address the systematic challenges that are posed by climate risk. This symposium is an opportunity for us to invite you to join us in this endeavor. If fully funded next year, the Center for Innovation in Risk Analysis for Climate Adaptation and Decision-Making, or CIRCAD, will consist of at least 2 academic sites, Duke University and the University of Georgia, a diverse consortium of insurance and finance industry partners, and an essential group of nonprofit and governmental collaborators. CIRCAD will be designed so that projects engage directly with climate-affected communities, seeking resilient solutions that work for the good of the community and are equitable and just. Those of you who represent community organizations, rather than, say, an academic entity or a business, I hope you'll also find an opportunity to join us in this regard. In the course of pursuing our research and implementation goals, CIRCAD will also be recruiting, mentoring, and helping to place a workforce prepared to address climate risk. We envision this occurring through four main mechanisms: undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral research fellowships and mentorship opportunities, student-led project teams that leverage existing initiatives like Design Climate, Climate Plus, Data Plus, and the Best Connections program, affiliation with two new advanced degree programs, including the Masters of Engineering in Climate Sustainability and in Financial Technology. I heard from Sarah Oliver this afternoon, the director of the Masters of Engineering in Climate Sustainability, that applying students have already heard about this initiative and are applying in part for that reason. So that's pretty exciting. And fourth, internship and co-op and job placement opportunities with our private and public sector partners. Not only will these experiences help students both in technical and professional skills in confronting the pressing real-world climate problems, but they'll also bring value to our community partners by giving them direct access, our industry partners, I should say, by giving them direct access to proven climate-ready future employees. All this is to say that we hope this symposium will be your first step in working with us to design the research, training, and outreach activities that will be pursued by CIRCAD. A second and possibly synergistic outlet for the products of this symposium is the Duke Climate Research Innovation Seed Program, or CRISP. Funded by the Office of Climate and Sustainability and aligned with the Duke Climate Commitment, this round of CRISP will provide research awards of up to $100,000 to support projects specifically addressing climate and community resilience, as well as $20,000 ideation awards for projects on other research themes. The CRISP deadline is Monday, February 26th, leaving you with just enough time to turn the ideas from this week's symposium into winning proposals. With these goals in mind, our two-day symposium is structured so that today is about providing you with the background you need on the insurance and finance sectors and how they confront climate risk. We'll be hearing from an eminent keynote speaker, Duke's inaugural climate leader in residence, and a panel of industry and nonprofit experts. As you listen to them, I'd want you to take particular note of the challenges that they face and think about how your own areas of expertise and scholarship can help them in addressing these challenges. Because tomorrow morning, registered participants will rejoin our panelists in a set of thematic work groups designed to support the identification of the insurance and finance industry's most pressing needs and the design of responsive research projects that draw on Duke's unique strengths. I know how busy you all are, and I know how hectic your weeks can be and how many draws there are on your time, both personal and professional. So I appreciate you taking this substantial time out of your schedule to join us. I think we've got a really compelling program planned, and I think you'll find your time to be well spent. At this time, I'll turn the podium over to Adrienne Stiff-Roberts. Dr. Stiff-Roberts is the Jeffrey N. Vinik Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering in the Pratt School of Engineering and Associate Dean for Community-Based Innovation. Dr. Stiff-Roberts' research explores thin film deposition of semiconductor materials on optoelectronic devices, including solar cells and light-emitting diodes. And among her many service roles, she serves on the research subcommittee of Duke's Climate Commitment Advisory Council. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adrienne Stiff-Roberts.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. So I'm so pleased to welcome you all to this inaugural Duke Climate Collaboration Symposium. So we've just heard the ambitious charge for this gathering, and I hope everyone feels energized by the potential for contributing to meaningful, actionable outcomes by the event's conclusion tomorrow. I feel excited because this symposium embodies one of the most compelling aspects of the Duke Climate Commitment. It extends an invitation. As a faculty member, I think of the Duke Climate Commitment as an invitation not only to consider how your individual impact on the climate or to consider the extent to which you follow sustainable practices, but it's an invitation to imagine how your expertise can help address one of the most pressing challenges facing society today. And that can feel like a tall order. It's not trivial to pivot to or embark on a new research direction. That's why this symposium is so essential to provide the background, the connections, and the intellectual creativity to support such a transition. I'm also excited about the intention for participants in this symposium to consider the impacts of climate risk on community resilience. In my role as Associate Dean for Community-Based Innovation in the Pratt School of Engineering, I'm focused on supporting and facilitating use-inspired research and design among our faculty, community-based learning for our students, and STEM outreach to the community. Our goals for community-based innovation include fostering real-world impact and building trust in science and engineering. And to accomplish these goals through research efforts, it's critically important to work in partnership with communities. Community members and organizations have a wealth of experiences and perspectives that can enhance the quality and relevance of research questions when they have a seat at the table from the beginning. So fortunately, through the Office of Durham and Community Affairs and the newly formed Duke Center for Community Engagement, there is university support to assist in developing and sustaining these relationships. So I encourage you to keep this in mind and to think of ways to engage directly with community early and often as you craft new research directions. So you have an excellent program in store this afternoon, and I wish you great ingenuity for your workshop tomorrow. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Francis Bouchard, who will be introducing today's keynote speaker. Francis is the inaugural Duke University Climate Leader in Residence and is the Managing Director for Climate at Marsh McLennan, a global professional services firm, where he works across the firm's 4 core businesses to drive climate-focused commercial and social impact initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Francis.
Thanks, Adrienne. For those of you who have ever wanted to introduce your old boss and say something about him publicly, you're going to watch me do it. So learn from me here. And I'm not going to read the bio. I mean, there's a lot in the bio you can read. You can go on Wikipedia. You can do whatever you want. I mean, 32 years running the Reinsurance Association of America, Georgetown Law, I think Cincinnati undergrad, Vietnam vet, industry leader on so many levels in so many ways. But I want to tell you a few things that you can't read in the bio, and probably not a lot of people know about Frank. The first thing I want to say is Frank is undoubtedly the longest and loudest voice from the insurance industry on climate that there is. And I can tell you this out of personal experience. In 1996, looking in the crowd, a few of you voted in '96 election. Well, Al Gore, if you recall, Al Gore was running for re-election, and he started going around the country talking about this thing called global warming, and it was causing a bit of a stir. And he found a voice in the wild from the private sector who was also talking about global warming. And he started quoting Frank Nutter. Now, at the time, I was Frank's federal lobbyist. For those of you who remember what the mid-'90s was, when the Republicans took back the House for the first time in 40 plus years. So it was my job to explain to the Republican leaders in the House what Frank was saying and what he wasn't saying about global warming and why the hell the reinsurance sector was agreeing with Al Gore on anything. So I learned early how deeply Frank felt about climate change, and he really helped teach me a lot about the complexities and the impact on the insurance sector, but also to show you just how serious he was taking it. The last board meeting that I attended from the RA when I was working for them, Frank had Jeremy Leggett speak at the board. This was 1998, right out of Greenpeace, and he brought a Greenpeace activist to speak to a bunch of reinsurance executives. Now, that doesn't happen a lot, I'm telling you, right? But this is someone who has understood the intersection between insurance, climate, and science for a long time and has committed really an incredible career to doing just that. The second bit, and that is why I think this meeting in particular is so apropos, is that Frank has been committed to tightening that alliance between the science community and the insurance, reinsurance community, again, for 30 plus years, and not just in word or in passing. And he's put a lot of time, sweat, equity, money, resources, priority to it. Just a few off the top. He spent 6 years on the board of UCAR, which is the University Cooperative on Atmospheric Research. 10 years on the board of the Center for Health and Global Environmental Research, affiliated with Harvard. I might have gotten that one wrong, Frank, but I'll make it up to you. He was on the board of the Bermuda Institute for Oceanic Sciences. He has a long-standing engagement, dialogue, relationship with NOAA. It doesn't matter who the NOAA administrator is. Somehow they pass along the name that Frank Nutter is somebody you need to know, you need to work with. So he has personally been driving this connection, kind of what we're doing here, right? He's been doing it for about 30 years. And just as another example, last week, NOAA in Asheville, North Carolina, announced an $85 million grant to one of their, I guess, subsidiaries to focus on climate-related data and working with the insurance sector even closer to make sure that that data is used in the way that will actually benefit society. And Frank was invited there as the insurance industry representative. So, this connection that we're trying to make here and what this whole CIRCAD effort is about is something that really reflects Frank's career from really ever since I started working for him in the 90s. Even to the point where there was one effort in particular that I really found fascinating in the 90s. Some of you here may have actually worked on it. And that was NASA's mission to Planet Earth, where we actually, under Frank's leadership, were trying to bring that capability to the insurance sector as well, where we really could leverage off of some of the advanced technology that even NASA would be using for their efforts. And then the third thing, which is a bit more personal, you have early stages in your career where you learn from the people around you, and you don't learn from books anymore. You actually learn from doing. And when Frank and I were working together in the 1990s, it was actually quite similar to an era that I think we're about to enter here. And that was post 1992, Hurricane Andrew had decimated Florida. And the insurance industry kind of had a shock and woke up and said, we're not doing something right. The calculations are off, or maybe, relying on past lost data isn't going to be sufficient anymore. So an effort began that to look at what role the federal government could be playing in supporting and backstopping the private insurance sector. And not surprisingly, Frank was chosen to chair this effort. And long story short, it became divisive within the insurance sector, with some of the large primary companies trying to get free reinsurance and the reinsurers kind of being pushed aside. It just became a kind of a tussle. And I was a young lobbyist at the time, and you kind of wonder how these internecine or family fights are going to go. And it was really Frank who taught me, showed me through day in, day out, how he managed this, how there can be ethics in policy, how there can be respect in Washington, even with the people you disagree with, how you can partner without, how should I say this, without denigrating. You can disagree without denigrating. You can, find common alignment with folks. And those were early lessons that I took in my career that have really formed almost the basis for how I have gone about to try to do my own efforts, both here and in the 20 years or so that I was with Zurich as well. So, I mean, there's a lot to be learned from Frank. I know I've learned it. Now, one thing, there is a little bit of a controversy in his past, and not a lot of people know this either, but I feel I have to disclose it because I do know, and that is in 1612, there was a woman named Alice Nutter who was burned at the stake as a witch. And I think she's an ancestor. And there's still controversy today about, and Norman, maybe you can get to the bottom of this for us, whether she was actually a witch or a Catholic. And back then, I don't think it really mattered. They were going to burn her. Well, I'm not suggesting Frank is a witch by any stretch, but he has two characteristics that, I don't know, just give me a seed of question and doubt. One is that he hates onions. And I don't know if there are any scholars out there on demons and whatnot, but I think witches hate onions, don't they? That's my recollection. And the second one is he has a weird proclivity to shave his head every year, which, I don't know. He can explain it to you. It's actually for a good cause, but I think it's a strange thing. Anyways, look, I have learned a lot from this gentleman. He's been a leader in every regard. I'm thrilled that he agreed to come and speak to us today. I'm even more excited that he agreed to kind of help us think through some of the CIRCAD stuff and bring his network to the table here that we can all participate in. So with that, Frank, I want to say thank you. The floor is yours.
Francis got one thing wrong.
Not the witch part, though.
Alice Nutter was hanged as a witch, and she was hanged twice. She was found to be a witch because of her, I think, her religious beliefs. She was tried and hanged that afternoon, and then they brought her back to an intersection of a major road in England at the time, and hanged her again, just to make sure everybody could see what happens if you're a witch. But Francis, thank you for that robust introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you. I'm going to give some remarks that hopefully put some factual context into what the center is doing as it relates to insurance. And I'm also going to talk about how advocacy and the adaptation space related to climate risk and extreme weather looks like, what it looks like, and hopefully at the end talk about, well, what do I see as the potential parameters, if you will, of research that might be appropriate here as you explore what the research agenda should be. So if we've got this right, and we don't have this right, should I be, there you go. That's my picture from about 8 years ago, by the way, just in case. I actually spoke on a program one time, and someone came up and said that I looked better in the photos than I did in person. So it seemed a little indiscreet. So let me start with this comment, this picture. Robert Louis Stevenson. Sooner or later, everyone sits down to a banquet of consequences. We didn't celebrate it, but we just celebrated the 200th anniversary of the conclusion reached by a professor actually in France who mathematically determined that the atmosphere was an insulating vehicle, and that's why the Earth was warmer than it otherwise would be. The term greenhouse effect was not used until 1900, but in 1822, it was clear that the atmosphere serves a purpose related to all this. Nearly concurrent with that time period was the evolution of the automobile and the burning of fossil fuels. I pulled out some dates that I thought might be interesting. One was that in 1857, there was a patent granted in the UK to someone who, the patent was described as obtaining motive power by the explosion of gases. So obviously the internal combustion engine. In 1886, Carl Benz of Mercedes-Benz had the first commercial production of the automobile. There are now 1.5 billion automobiles operating in the world. Notably, the United States doesn't not have the most, China does. And of course, the second industrial revolution occurred really from 1870 to 1914. So you really have this scientific understanding about nature, if you will, and our planet, and you have the development of technology, if you will, that's going to affect that. We are clearly now sitting down to the banquet of consequences, if you will. Bon appetit for that. The second thing I want to do very quickly is give you a quick tutorial. Let me go through all of these. What's reinsurance? Reinsurance is effectively the insurance of insurance companies. And the relevance of that, and the reason Francis cited a lot of things that I had done and the organization done to advance issues related to adaptation, is that for the most part, the reinsurance sector picks up a disproportionate amount of the insured losses that the insurance industry takes on. It's pretty consistently about 50%. So if State Farm, Allstate, USAA, Travelers, those kinds of companies have insured losses related to extreme weather events or climate events, about 50% of those really are getting passed on to the reinsurance sector. This chart is busy and you're not going to be able to read the small print, but the lower part reflects over the period of time the reinsurance sector's financial performance, and the upper part is the insurance sector's financial performance. And the real point of this chart, the carve-out things there are effectively major events that have occurred. And what this reflects is the fact that the insurance industry removes its volatility in its financial results by passing those losses on to the reinsurance sector. So every one of those rectangular events that you probably can't read very well is some major event. It could be a hurricane, it could be 9/11, be a liability crisis in the 80s, all of those things. What's always been notable to me about this chart is how much more frequent we're now seeing these major events where you have these losses. It's one thing to have them over a period of time, but now we're starting to see a collection, if you will, of these over a short period of time. So reinsurance capital. The real point I want to make in this slide, the dark brown part is really the reinsurance capital, if you will, the traditional reinsurance capital that supports these catastrophe risk. It looks like a mustard color to me from here. I'm not exactly sure what color you're seeing, but a mustard color is really the reinsurance assumed by traditional insurance companies. So these are companies that aren't really in the reinsurance business but assume some reinsurance. And the blue part is really what I want to focus on, is that over time, what you see is a consistent interest in the capital markets to invest in extreme weather events, catastrophe bonds, and other kinds of alternative capital products that become part of the financial structure in the insurance, reinsurance sector, if you will. And it's a critical part, and as you think about your research about where financing may come related to catastrophe events. It's roughly about $100 billion of alternative products in place already. And the potential there is extraordinary. And the reason these hedge funds, pension funds, other kinds of non-insurance vehicles invest in this, it's a diversification strategy for them. They are looking for ways to invest in something that's independent of the economics around the stock market. And so this has become a particularly interesting asset class for these non-traditional insurance investors. So I became president of the Reinsurance Association in 1982. That's the high peak down there. If anybody questions my influence over the industry, over my career, this chart probably shows that. These are companies that have licenses, reinsurance companies that have licenses in the United States to do reinsurance, and they report data to the association that I ran. By the way, Francis and I started working together in 1991. You could see there was an initial bump, a positive bump, and then he left in 1998, and the trend continued, if you will, largely fairly small industry. There are really effectively 30 companies that are in the reinsurance business. And the question would be, well, gosh, how could they be taken? Just those companies could take on the risk. And the reason, this is the corollary to that chart, and that is that you have consolidation in the business and pretty extraordinary capital investment in all this. The big bump here was really Berkshire Hathaway, so Warren Buffett. That Berkshire Hathaway owns 3 reinsurance companies, and they're a major player in this area, a significant player both in traditional reinsurance as well as these alternative investments, if you will. So that's your tutorial on reinsurance. So what's the problem here? And there are 2 charts here. This is disaster occurrences that are climate related in the United States in, what does it say, 2011 to 2021. And what may be notable here is that if you looked at that time period in the 1960s, there were roughly 200 disaster declarations in the United States in any annual year. And between 2000 and 2010, there were 600 every year. The explosion, if you will, both in events as well as the willingness on the part of the Congress and the federal government to deal with this is reflected really in this chart. This is public disaster assistance funding over that period of time, that 10-year period of time. Notably, Louisiana gets per capita the most money, and Arizona gets the least money. No surprise there. But let me put this in some context for you. If you take 2017, just the disaster assistance, the response paid by the federal government in 2017 exceeded the discretionary budgets of every federal agency except the Pentagon. Exceeded, 1 year exceeded the federal budget, the discretionary budget of those agencies. The combined discretionary budgets were exceeded if you combine the Commerce Department, Department of Energy, Department of Interior, Department of Labor, Department of Transportation, the Department of Treasury, EPA, and the Army Corps. The amount of money being paid for disaster response and assistance is extraordinary, and in fact reflects basically an off-budget financing that the federal government and the Congress engage in. The question is what can be done to offset that, whether it's mitigation, better community resilience, or insurance, private insurance. So again, let me show you this chart. And I realize these are busy charts and maybe hard to read, but these are the economic losses, not insured losses, by peril over this period of time. And the tropical cyclone, the one on the far left column, basically reflects $2 trillion of economic losses over this period of time. For flooding, it's nearly $1.8 billion, $1.8 trillion. And the chart on the right is the cumulative number of billion-dollar events, which has grown pretty dramatically, again, by type of event. Let me show you the same information, but insured losses. So same basic information, but now we're looking at the insured losses. And effectively what this shows is two things I'd like to point out. One is the insurance gap, the loss, economic losses that are not covered by insurance is effectively 2/3 on a consistent basis. That the insured losses tend to be about 1/3 of what the economic losses are for most major events. And it's going to vary by event, but over the cumulative over time. The other thing that I want to show you is this chart on the right. These are severe convective storms, thunderstorms, tornadoes, lightning, and the number of these events is pretty remarkable. And it has led to what I'm going to talk about in a second, and that is a recalibration, if you will, of risk by a number of insurance companies. If you look at the severe convective storms, not one of them exceeded $1 billion. Not one of them. But in 2023 alone, there was $60 billion of insured losses related just to effectively thunderstorms. So this is what the insurance sector is looking at by way of losses. So this is just in the U.S. This is not global, if you will. We could talk about any one of these events, but the one thing I really wanted to show you is the light blue. Looks like it's light blue from here. And that's the rolling 4-year total. And what you'll see there is an industry looking at the impact of insured losses that's growing pretty dramatically. What I would say is that most climate-related risk, however, is not in the insurance sector. It's on the public sector balance sheet. It relates to what communities and the federal government are dealing with. So what are the consequences of this? This chart is a fair plan is a fair access to insurance requirements is really what it is, or a beach plan are both required by state law in the states that have them. And this is a national one. I'm going to show you some individual state ones in a second. But the consequence of those losses is that in the homeowners insurance market, so think all the companies writing homeowners insurance in the United States, in 2023, the quote combined ratio, which is effectively losses paid plus administrative expenses, so think agents' commissions and taxes paid to the state and that kind of thing, was 112. And what that means is that for every dollar that the homeowners insurers collected by way of premiums, they paid out $1.12 for the losses. Now that's 1 year, but the trend is pretty dramatic. And the effect of that is that the homeowners writers have also increased premiums, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, and on a national basis by 12%. But if you look at certain specific markets, it's dramatically higher than that. In Louisiana, 24 insurers have withdrawn or become insolvent in the last 3 years. In California, 7 of the 12 largest homeowners writers in California have either paused writings or are no longer going to write new policies. It's the point that Mark made about the distress in these markets. So what the homeowners insurers have done is they've recalibrated risk, meaning they've determined what their pricing should be. And as a result of that, the pricing signal that comes with insurance premiums has gone up pretty dramatically. And of course, what you have is consumer sticker shock for those premiums. Again, pretty dramatic, particularly in some markets. So let me show you a chart that's, so these are the FAIR plans. The Fair Access to Insurance plans are the beach plans. And what's pretty obvious here is that Louisiana, California, Florida are the particularly distressed insurance markets as reflected in the additional writings by these state-mandated facilities that are providing insurance. North Carolina, by the way, shows up on here, the North Carolina Joint Underwriting Association, which is effectively the FAIR plan, so anybody could go there if they can't get insurance. And the North Carolina Insurance Underwriting Association is the beach plan. So if you have a home in the Outer Banks or something like that, that's not necessarily where you're going to get your coverage, but that's the fallback, if you will, for all that. It is notable that around the axis, intersection of the axis, is that there are a lot of programs that are not so distressed. That at least at this point, we see that in particular states that's particularly distressed. In Louisiana, the premium increase from 2017 to 2022 for these plans, Louisiana alone, 388% increase, 388% increase. In Florida, 274% increase in these residual markets, these fail-safe mechanisms. In North Carolina, it was 69%, and in the beach plan for North Carolina, 33%. So clearly more modest, but again reflecting the impact, if you will, of these disasters and the recalibration of risk. So I'm going to turn to something else here, and that is what I mentioned at the outset. What does adaptation look like from an advocacy point of view, particularly in Washington? What is it that I and my organization has been advocating for that's trying to deal with adaptation to extreme weather events? And I say it in the context that what you're doing here is more systemic and more valuable in the long run. But this is the way it looks, if you will, in the halls of Congress when you testify before a Senate committee or the House Financial Services Committee, or you're dealing in forums that are looking at, well, what changes could be made, what are practically, politically to be made. So let me start with NOAA. Francis mentioned NOAA. NOAA, what is maybe not fully understood, maybe this group understands it, what fully understood is that nearly all climate and weather information, data, comes from NOAA or NASA. The insurance industry doesn't fly planes into hurricanes. It doesn't have satellites. It doesn't have weather buoys. NOAA is an extraordinary resource for the industry writ large, not just insurance companies, but also for the program that you're developing here and the relationships that you want to have. I just want to reiterate what Francis said. NOAA just 2 weeks ago announced an $85 million commitment to work with our sector and a couple of others focused on improving data collection, data transmission, data access, and research. You know, what should they be working on? And I really commend, Mark and you and I have talked about this, I really commend you as you look at research topics is to think about how to interact with NOAA, and we've talked about some connections there to make sure that that's reinforced. But I just want to emphasize the primacy of NOAA as the source, the core source of data. Question is, can it be improved in a way that would make it more usable, or you've used the term actionable? Some states have mitigation grants. North Carolina has one, South Carolina has one, California has one focused on earthquake. Louisiana, Florida, and Alabama all have grant programs. So consumers could get a grant from these programs to deal with hazard mitigation. What's notable about that is that at the state level, those grants are tax exempt. At the federal level, it's taxable income. So again, looking at what's adaptation advocacy look like, it's, well, heck, remove that. If you're going to give someone $5,000 to improve the resilience of their home, don't tax that as $5,000 in additional income, but that's what the federal government does. CDERS, the Community Disaster Resilience Act. It was signed into law by President Biden in 2021. I have that right, 22? 23, thank you. It basically requires federal agencies to prioritize communities that have natural peril risk, but also are socially and economically vulnerable. And therefore, it's a core part of what federal agencies now look at by way of the billions of dollars that they're giving for disaster response and recovery. What I think and what we've advocated for is that you really should provide some change in tax law to incentivize the private sector to do the same thing, to buy resilience bonds, or to invest, if you will, in municipal obligations or local tax district obligations with some incentive. In this advocacy, we've used the Build America bonds, which were adopted after the financial crisis of 2008, as kind of a prototype for that, if you will, to say, and at that time, basically, these bonds for recovery, financial recovery at the time, were given a premium, if you will, funded by the federal government so that these bonds were attractive to be purchased. And so the CDERS program is an excellent program. The deeper and more reliable well of money is probably in the private sector, given that the Congress has to appropriate money for the disaster assistance. Incentives related to federal disaster assistance. The last building code adopted by any state was building code related to this was 2008. Building codes are remarkably valuable as ways to provide parameters for developers and builders about how to build their properties. My recommendation has been, my advocacy has been, well, provide some incentives for states to do that. Perhaps it's to make disaster assistance, there's a sharing formula. It's largely 75% federal, 25%. The state has to match 25% state. Provide some incentives there for that. If they adopt a building code that meets current building code standards, then perhaps the sharing percentage should be 90-10 versus 75-25. Do something to provide a carrot, if you will, for states to do the right thing by way of building codes. The Shelter Act is a proposal to provide homeowners with a tax credit related to any mitigation measures that they adopt. Again, it makes sense to me to do that, but that's not the tax law does not permit that. So this is a continuation of this. The Coastal Barrier Resources Act. The Coastal Barrier Resources Act identified properties in coastal areas and basically says that once that property has been identified, so these are not homes, these are undeveloped properties largely, that federal resources, National Flood Insurance Program, Army Corps of Engineers, anything like that cannot be provided. It doesn't mean that the owner can't develop the property. They can do that. They can build whatever local laws allow them to do, but federal resources can't be used for all that. My thought here has been, we'll expand the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. If we need to be pulling back from these areas, perhaps what we ought to be doing is transferring development rights from coastal property owners into inland areas or something like that, but to expand the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. The National Flood Insurance Program does have funds where they relocate people and communities. It's a pretty modest fund, and the recommendation here is to expand that. I put a category here of federal government lead by example, and here are my examples of what the federal government could be doing. Adopt a flood standard that the federal government applies to federal property. In other words, you be an example to local governments by showing that the federal government is applying its mitigation measures to its own property. The second would be target disaster assistance. There are a lot of people in these high hazard areas that probably have the resources to either pay the insurance premium or fund their own recovery. But there are a lot of communities where that is not the case, and perhaps these ought to be targeted. The CEDARS Act does some of that, if you will. The third is government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, basically the secondary mortgage market. Why not put some incentives in what they buy or what they want mortgages to be in high-risk areas by having the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, provide some financial incentive for doing the right thing at the consumer level for loans. Much to the credit of the advocates that achieved this I'm going to get the year wrong since I got the other one wrong. I'll get this one wrong as well. But 4 or 5 years ago, a coalition was successfully able to get the Congress to adopt a provision that 6% of all monies paid by the federal government for disaster assistance would be earmarked for pre-disaster mitigation. 6%. It's a remarkable amount of money. When you go back to the numbers that I was using about disaster assistance, 6% is really a remarkable number. Increase it, if you will. And the last thing is expand the NTSB, National Traffic Safety Board. If you any kind of plane wreck, train wreck, whatever it is, the National Traffic Safety Board pulls together all of the parties that had some interest in it. The manufacturers, the suppliers, local emergency people, local officials. They pull it together largely to learn the lessons. What happened in this event that are lessons that could be applied to improve safety in that. Why not do that with disasters? We have so many of these natural disasters. And yes, communities may differ, but the reality is there are going to be some common lessons learned from these kinds of things. Why not create a National Traffic Safety Board type entity that focuses on response, recovery, and does not point blame? That's not what the NTSB does, but in fact, it takes the lessons that are learned. So I was asked if I would put down some of my thoughts about what the future might look like for property insurance. And so the first point is insurable communities. Are we moving toward communities that because of sea level rise or extreme events that are really not insurable, if you will, not insurable in the traditional sense? And that, I'm sure, is a goal of looking at the project you have in the research here is how do we, if we can't stop sea level rise, which of course we can't, what should we be doing to make these communities insurable in the private market or in the public market, if you will? Again, in the spirit of what's the future look like, is it property insurers in retreat? Are property insurers providing a product no one can afford in certain areas? And the answer is clearly yes for certain people, particularly in social and economically vulnerable communities, but frankly even in communities with more wealth. And if they are in retreat, what happens? So here's my experience. Francis mentioned that I've been doing this for a long time. So I kind of looked back over distressed markets, distressed insurance markets over time. And what happened with all of those? And is this the future of that? So in 1968, there were floods in Pennsylvania. And building upon that, the National Flood Insurance Act was passed because the insurance companies did not want to write flood. They still don't really want to write flood, but they didn't want to write flood insurance. The Congress, politicians do not like a void, if you will, in people's ability to find ways to finance their recovery. So they adopted the National Flood Insurance Act. The right, not listed here, in 1968, there were civil disturbances in the United States. The Congress passed a statute called the Riot Reinsurance Act. Again, the insurance companies did not want to write in inner cities, inner urban areas. Largely, these riots were as a result of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and you had businesses in core urban areas that were struggling to get insurance because the insurance companies didn't want to write it. It was deemed the problem was that there needed to be some backstop, if you will, related to reinsurance, that for insurance companies to get them to write. The Federal Riot Reinsurance Program was passed in 1968 really as a way to get the insurance companies to do this, but it became the source of the development of FAIR plans, the fair access to insurance requirements. While we think of them now as largely focused on extreme weather and catastrophe risk, in fact, they were started because of inner city urban property risk. It had nothing to do with that, but had to do with the insurance companies pulling back. California Earthquake Authority. The California Earthquake Authority was created after the Loma Prieta earthquake. The insurance companies didn't want to write earthquake insurance. They didn't want to be required to offer it. So the California Earthquake Authority was adopted. I guess I've got it up here. I can put some of these up here. Oh, sorry. Let me go back to this. Was created. The insurance companies agreed to capitalize this entity. It's a state-sponsored entity, but capitalize the entity, and it became the place where anybody looking for earthquake insurance could get earthquake insurance, since the private market didn't want to write it. Liability crisis in the 1980s. Most of you look too young to be concerned about the liability crisis in the 1980s, but the reality is the insurance companies started pulling back from writing liability coverage for playgrounds, daycare centers, all kinds of kind of normal routine things that go on in American society, but the concern was the tort system was disproportionately affecting these markets. And so while the state and Congress didn't pass anything, effectively the entities that had these exposures created their own market. ACE and XL they are now traditional insurance companies and reinsurance companies, but in the 1980s they were created and placed in Bermuda as a way to self-insure their own risk, again, because the insurance companies did not want to write it. 9/11. After 9/11, the reinsurance market pulled back from providing coverage for acts of terrorism. Again, the Congress is not willing to let the insurance consumers, in this case commercial insurers primarily, not have insurance markets. And so they created the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, which again filled this need for providing a backstop, if you will, for insurance companies. And Florida citizens and Louisiana citizens in particular, these are state entities created primarily because of distressed markets in Florida and Louisiana, obviously, as insurance companies began to reassess the risk and all that. And the statistic that I looked at in Florida in particular is that prior to the creation of the Florida Citizens, which is the state entity that if you want to buy insurance, that's one place you go, that 94% of the Florida insurance market were written by national carriers. State Farm, Allstate, Travelers, USAA. Today it's 18%. And really what happened was that the major companies decided to pull back, and now you have a market that's largely comprised of small, less capitalized entities and very reinsurance dependent. So let me conclude with my thoughts about relevance, if you will, here about the insurance sector and you looking at your research options and ideas that you might want to think about. So let me start with this one. Let me back up. Let me start with this one. Rethink the business model. So what is the business model of insurance? It's an actuarial business model. It's built on, as we like to say, it's kind of driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror. It's built upon historical loss information, trended forward primarily using economic factors. The regulatory system is built around this same model. And as you look at research topics, you're going to have to struggle with and deal with this question about a regulatory system that's also built upon an actuarial approach to things, looking at historical trends. And this works if the loss costs are linear, as in one damn thing after another, or whether it's cyclical, meaning the same damn thing over and over again. That works, but that's not the environment we're in property insurance, particularly in high-risk areas. What the insurance companies would say about climate risk and why do the companies invest in fossil fuels and that kind of thing, and largely because they have historically seen that their business model, if you will, that if there's a climate impact in their business, it'll show up in their loss experience. They're not going to be able to tease it out. They're not going to be able to say, well, this is the climate factor associated with these losses we're having. But the reality is they're writing one-year policies. They can reprice them if the regulatory system lets them. And in most states, insurance rates are regulated like a utility. They have to be approved by the state. They can non-renew. They can pull out of markets, which is what's happening in a number of these states. So they have options, if you will, because they have a short-term contract. My point would be, isn't the future more important than the past, if you will? But by the time that climate change shows up in this information, it's too late. It's too late to properly assess and price the risk. It's entirely likely that you can price and hedge against short-term weather risk. The question is, and I would encourage you in your research agenda to think, how do you price and hedge against long-term climate risk? It's clearly a different matter, different approach. So rethinking the business model. Invest in resilience projects. Again, I think this is a wonderful area for research and consideration. There are clearly incentives, you would think, for the insurance companies to invest in resilience projects. The regulatory system has some impediments because the system requires risk-based capital analysis. And unless these investments are publicly traded and publicly rated, they're not going to meet the risk-based capital requirements. So that's part of what you're going to have to deal with, if you will, in investing in projects. But there clearly is an interest and a value in getting the insurance companies that have a deep well, like 30% of the municipal bond market is on the balance sheets of insurance companies. The leverage opportunity there is remarkable to be used. Another one that I know you have discussed, I know it's in some of your materials, is community-based approaches to looking at risk. It's wonderful if I own a home in an area that's high risk and I put shutters on it and I tie down the roof and I do the right roofing shingles. That's fine, but is that really going to be the way that the community is going to deal with flood? Well, no, not really. Is that the same way with wildfire risk? So a lot of these problems are community-sized problems that need a community approach, if you will, and looking at that. I know, Mark, that you all are thinking about those kinds of things, and I really commend that as something to look at. The communities struggle, as you might expect, with a competition for resources. Are you going to buy an insurance product because of some contingent event? Or are you going to fund the police department? Are you going to fund more teachers? Are you going to fund other kinds of projects? That's what they'll struggle with. The insurance companies are going to struggle with what I know you've thought about, and that is pilot projects. Unless you have a diversification of these kinds of projects, the insurance companies are going to say, well, if you concentrate all the risk in this community, that's not the way we think about it. But if you've got 8 of these communities and they're in various areas and maybe they're different perils, that's going to be a more attractive way to approach looking at pilot projects as a way to prove that this is a community-based approach is valuable. I really commend this as a particularly strong thing for your research. Incentivizing homeowner mitigation measures. Even though we've just talked about community-based approaches, you still want individuals to think about that. Maybe it's credits in their insurance. Maybe it's increasing the grant programs that I talked about earlier. Here's the Holy Grail. an all-risk insurance policy. Maybe it's not every risk, but the problem insurance companies have is adverse selection. If you're going to sell flood insurance and the only people who are going to buy it have a home on the coast or on a river, the companies struggle with that kind of concentration of risk. But if you're a national company or a regional company and you're writing an all-risk policy and you have a diversification geographically and by peril, the price for those individual perils is going to be perhaps nominal for some of these risks, even though it's going to be high for certain kinds of risk. I still view this as a holy grail. I mean, and I don't mean that in a you can't achieve it. I mean it as in I would do research focused on how you can achieve that, whether it's pilot projects or other ways to get your insurance partners to think more holistically about this problem. Back to the future in the flood insurance program, the Congress has short-term extended the National Flood Insurance Act 27 times in the last 3 years, maybe 4 years. It's outrageous to do that. I don't know how you plan around a statute if you're in the federal government or if you're a company working around the National Flood Insurance Act with something like that. Certainly that, and there are features within the statute that if they would actually do a long-term extension that could incentivize the further development of a private insurance market, as we've discussed, Mark. So my last comment, I'm not sure there's another slide. No, there you go. That's okay. But this is my last comment about your research. I was struck by, in preparing for this, I read a National Academy of Science research report, fairly recent, and they were trying to come up with a resilience standard. Is there a standard that can be used for resilience? They focused on the Gulf Coast, and they concluded that there was no single standard for resilience. But they did focus on something that I would encourage you to think about in your research, and that is they said there were 6 assets in all communities: natural, built, financial, human, social, and political. And their point was, as you think about research, maybe you can't deal with all these in terms of resilience in every community. Maybe you need to prioritize these in certain communities. But it was an interesting way to think about resilience, that it's not simply rebuilding roads or rebuilding people's houses. It's rebuilding the fabric, if you will, of these communities. And I thought the 6 assets were wonderful. Last thing, and I hope I'm roughly within my time, last thing that I also looked at, there was an op-ed by a man I don't know, Professor Joseph Mankin of Dartmouth. You know him? And he made the following comment, that climate change is a collective tragedy. A collective tragedy. And people have a right to science. And his point was that the privatization of research around community resilience and climate was unfortunate, that private research doesn't get the scrutiny that public research does. And as you proceed, I really commend what you're doing to bring in insurance companies and others, but largely to make access to your research and your thoughts public, because it's in the words of Mencken, it's a public tragedy that needs public scrutiny. So thank you very much. I think the system here is that I'm not taking questions now, but I will be here to participate, ask the questions ask some questions for the panel, and I certainly will be here through the reception. So thank you.
Thanks, Frank. I think you did a great job of illuminating some of the complexities, but also pointing the direction to some solutions too. So that was hopeful and encouraging in that regard. Thank you.